Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read along podcast. The Wheel of Time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
That is your host, Greg, who somehow still knows very little about the Wheel of Time, even though he usually pretends otherwise.
And that is Tylor, our resident expert, who makes sure you know how much he knows about the Wheel of Time.
It's a lot. Join us each week as we continue our journey through Robert Jordan's great fantasy epic, exploring the books, the television show, ill-advised discussions of visual media on a non-visual podcast, and so much more. Although actually not, it's just that.
Yes, all that and actually nothing else as we travel on, and I know what this means now, through the glass columns.
Yeah, he really doesn't know all that much.
No, you don't know that much.
Heidi ho, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly read-along Wheel of Time podcast. It is so good to be back with you. I, of course, am your host, Greg, who knows very little about the Wheel of Time, but fear not, dear listener, for I am joined by the man, the myth, the legend, the one who knows actually what the heck is going on in these books. It's Tylor. Tylor, how are you tonight?
I'm doing very well. I've learned that I can make you take a hiccup if I take a really little drink right before you're going to throw to me, and it's really funny to see what happens every time I do it. You handled it pretty well tonight. I am mostly excited because I think I mentioned a couple weeks ago our kind of or at least my line in the sand is often like the 20 to 25 chapter mark. I don't think that is always where Robert Jordan like starts sprinting forward, but I often feel like he kind of gives himself a good third of a book before he really gets rolling. And I don't know whether we are yet at the fun part of the roller coaster, but I feel like maybe a little acceleration is happening this week. What was your take? Was this just a passing the time few chapters, or did you get some like good real enjoyment out of this?
I yield stuff. No, I did actually get some good enjoyment out of these things. There are a few intriguing developments that I'm looking forward to discussing and having explained to me. But I think my mood on the Aiel stuff has switched now that we're back in the part of the world that is more familiar. I don't know. I got nervous that sounded racist in one as I approached it. I guess it's racist against the Aiel. But, like, yes, important things were happening over the wall, but I didn't have an emotional attachment to over there. And so now that we, much quicker than I expected, got Rand back into the kingdom I care about, I'm curious to see where this goes and how this develops.
I'm about ready to go through my kind of description of the first of these three chapters, but I just came up with something that I knew I wanted to reference, but I can make it into a game, and boy, do I like making things into games. At the end of one or all of these chapters, I am going to reference a community joke. Do you want to take a stab at what community joke you think unites these three chapters?
Well, my go-to community reference is always, I have the weirdest boner right now, which pretty much applies to most chapters in this book.
Well, I wish that was the name of chapter 21, let me tell you.
But wait, here's my real guess. My another favorite is the dean saying, I hope this doesn't awaken something in me, which is also relevant to these chapters. So I will play the game and be excited to hear it when it comes. So we are, of course, as Tylor just alluded to, talking about three chapters tonight as promised. They are Chapter 21, The Gift of the Blade, Chapter 22, Birdcalls by Night, and Chapter 23, The Fifth I Give You. Tylor, take us into Chapter 21.
The Gift of a Blade. The Aiel make camp with the maidens and about 50 of each other's society serving as Rand's guard. Moraine is concerned with Hadden and Kader and the Terangriel, and so she and Lan largely ignore Rand and go off to another area. He also notes that the Wise Ones have set up camp in such a way that anyone who wanted to approach him has to go through their camp, and he thinks that is almost certainly deliberate. He then thinks about Bale and Melinda and Dorinda, who are now newlywed, and he thinks about how he was surprised by many of the things about the wedding. In particular, he was kind of surprised by how much it was just as important that the women were joining each other's family as it was that one of them was marrying the man. He then sees Egwene and Aviendha kind of approach, and he seems kind of upset and a little concerned that they're going to have to see the bodies that have been hung up and are being brought down. But Egwene basically tries to reassure him immediately that none of this was his fault, and then Aviendha remarks that all of the men kind of think they are in charge of what is going on, and Egwene's response to this is actually surprise A, that Rand is seemingly as in control as he actually is, and then they start to get into a conversation about their surprise that Rand wasn't getting sick from the bodies, and that kind of causes Aviendha almost to seem concerned about his ability as a leader. He then starts to look for Asmodean when he sees Mat, and he wonders how Mat knew to ask about the sentries, and he wonders about how much he has changed recently. Rand then does find Asmodean, who warns him against Moraine, saying that she's the kind of person that you can never trust. Rand asks Asmodean about the ruins in the mountains, and Asmodean has no idea about them and says they could even be his home, as he was from a port. Rand then dismisses Asmodean, who is surprised that there are no traps on his tent that night, and Rand says that he has earned a temporary trust, but then he reassures him that he will destroy him if anything goes wrong, which causes Asmodean seemingly to think that that was Lews Therin speaking, and Rand reassures him that it was not. He then uses his Angreal to set a massive ward around the camp, thinking that he barely needs the Angreal anymore, even though it's a massive ward, and he thinks of the struggle to release Sidon when he does, and also of the enhanced senses that he has when he is channeling. At this point, he walks into his tent, where Aviendha kills a snake with her knife, and Rand is kind of upset at her that she took the risk of doing this rather than channeling, and when she says that he is concerned or worried about her, he lies and says he isn't. She then presents a sword to him with an elaborate hilt covered in gems and jewels, and she says that she is offering this to him to offset his debts. She says it was King Laman's sword and has been passed around through the generations, and the price has dropped precipitously because no Aiel will touch it for long enough even to get the gems out. He inspects the blade and realizes that it has been power forged, and he accepts the sword to cancel his debt, but then gives back the hilt and all of the gems to Aviendha, causing her to say that she is now in further debt than she was when she started. Rand seems surprised that she is angry about this, but eventually she seems to get her revenge by cooking the snake that she killed, but Aviendha is a little bit upset that this doesn't get a rise out of him. At this point, he asks about the wedding, and we learn some of the language of Aiel floral arrangements and how the bride wanted a particular flower in her arrangement. At this point, Rand asks if a man were to pursue a woman, what would that look like? And she says that doesn't really happen in Aiel culture. The exception is what now people are accusing Mat of doing, which is learning to sing, which is when someone tries to convince a maiden of the spear to give up the spears, and instead she doesn't, and teaches him to sing to entertain the other women. Rand asks who gave her necklace at this point, and she says a friend, and then Rand falls asleep and dreams of all three of his ladies naked, but one of them, Aviendha, beating him over the head. This was a chapter that I think is great if you really love romance. I'm about to sneeze. Take over.
This is not my favorite of our three chapters tonight. I won't really say I struggled, but I still am not finding myself that interested in learning about Aiel culture. I think if I want to blame my personal preferences on structure, I think part of it is we kind of learned a little while ago that a huge part of their culture is just broken now by Rand, and it's all changing. And then it's like, but let's talk about all the rituals and all the traditions that are still part of it. And I kind of don't find myself caring because either these are not important because they didn't break as part of that big thing, or they might still fall apart and not be there. So it's interesting because I would normally say I enjoy world building just in terms of the limited fantasy I read, but this is just not grabbing me. And it definitely reminds me of the big flashback chapter where it's like, you know, I could tell that there was a lot going on that was really cool, but I wasn't necessarily feeling personally engaged.
Yeah, I think the challenge that we're running into is what I am going to point out as the first instance of the community joke in this chapter, which is that we learn an enormous amount of Aiel culture, but it all happens in the background of a scene about killing a snake and cooking it and talking about what Aiel women want and don't want, right? There's this really interesting story about the wedding and what does that tell us about the relationship between men and women in Aiel culture and how is it different than in the wetlands, and how are Rand and Aviendha's kind of perspectives on this kind of telling us something about the way way they're thinking about each other. But all of that, I think, kind of gets lost because it's not happening in the foreground, it's happening in the background. Now do you know what community joke I'm going to reference in chapter 2?
Beetlejuice?
Man, you're so close, but no. I want to start this chapter then by talking about all of the characters at the beginning who I feel like we just get like a train of people walking past Rand for him to comment on how different they are than they were last book. I don't know whether this was effective for you, but we kind of get updates on Hadnan Kader and Moraine and Egwene and Aviendha and Matt all in just rapid succession with not a lot to string them together other than Rand happens to cross paths with each of them. Were there any of those characters that excited you or grabbed you more than this kind of background Aiel culture stuff that I agree with you, I think kind of gets washed out by everything around it?
I figured it out. It's Abed getting the woman to give birth in the background
there
of an
it
episode
is.
of Community. Yeah, there it is. I forgot about that. It's such a funny bit on that episode. I find myself most compelled by Matt, and I do feel a little guilty about that because I do where I'm checked out on Moraine is Moraine's always like, again, staring into the middle distance and being like, as if we have all the time in the world, and kind of hinting at that. There's not a lot of that here, but you get the impression she's still just, gathering the treasures to send them and kind of preparing for the world to be without her.
Yeah.
And Egwene feels like she's just so kind of dutifully in her lane. She is on her path to be a wise one. I think because that doesn't feel challenging, it's not that engaging, right? It kind of feels like she's Hermione, right? She's a dutiful honor student, and she's just going to go do exactly what they tell her and follow the rules, and then she'll slowly become a powerful wise one. And so I like that, and I'm interested to see how eventually I assume she has to choose between being a wise one and being an Aes Sedai or something like that. But for this part where it's just like she's just doing what they say, it's not that compelling. So so that's why I'm kind of left with Matt, and he gets a better moment, obviously, in the next chapter. But I think here it's really curious. I would say that Matt is losing his grip on Matt, and it's becoming clearer and clearer that whatever this presence is inside of him is taking control. And Rand is now noticing it, though he doesn't know exactly what he's noticing. Maybe I'll leave it there until the next chapter.
Well, I think the thing that was really interesting to me about Matt in this chapter is getting to see him through Rand's eyes in a chapter where Rand is acknowledging Lews Therin's voice in his head, right? There is not a lot of real estate in terms of word count between Rand wondering, I just don't understand what's going on with Matt. How did he know all this stuff about battles? And then literally, I think it's like a page and a half later in my edition of the books, he's quoting things from Lews Therin's memory. And that kind of near miss by Rand of thinking about it but not making that leap to connect it with his own experience, I thought was kind of really fascinating, of those two kind of ships passing in the night experiencing basically the same thing and neither of them really understanding the other.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting to me, and putting it on parallel, and I'm struggling in my head. I was just listening to a great new audiobook. It's a Marvel What If, but it's what if Venom landed on Moon Knight, and it's got this weird dynamic. I swear this is related, where Moon Knight as a character has a voice in his head, which is Kanju, the Egyptian god, and then you have Venom. So plus Moon Knight has 3 personalities. So I spent like the whole book being like, wait, who's talking and what's going on? And so I felt like as I was listening to that, and then I crossed over to this, and you get that same exact spirit. It's like at times he can be in conversation with that voice. So it does feel, again, I was thinking in the context of Moon Knight, the character, that feels like a multiple personalities thing, that it is a separate entity in some ways. But at other times it feels much more like he's imagining that voice, or it's I guess it's the difference between being in conversation and just reacting to somebody. Like, he's just sharing his reactions. He's not really actually like using the conversation to dig deeper. It's a subtle distinction, and I think I'm failing to make it.
No, I think I understand what you're saying. It's not quite the subtle distinction I was going to make, but I was really curious about Rand's moment with Asmodean in this same context, where Rand basically threatens Asmodean, and Asmodean gives him a look, and Rand's response is, "That was me, not Luz Theron." And the question I have is, do you believe Rand when he says that?
I think I'd still believe Rand when he says that, but I do think they went from being two circles to being a Venn diagram with very little space outside the middle. So in that particular moment, Rand can assert control, but he doesn't necessarily actually wield that control anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where I'm at, is I don't know how blurry the lines are, but I know the line between Luz Theron and Rand feels massively more blurry than it did, I think, like 300 pages ago when we first heard a voice in Rand's head. And that progression is a little bit troubling, even if it's mostly just happening by pure repetition. Any last thoughts on...
And I would say my other reaction to that is that while I think that line is as blurry as you said it is, in my mind, I haven't yet made up if that's a bad thing. It seems to me kind of an equal coin flip that the two of them uniting into one entity who has all the past of Luz Theron but all the presence of Rand could be a good thing, or it could be this is Rand going mad and it drives him crazy. So yes, agreed on the blurred lines, but also this extra dimension of like, how do I feel about that? I'm not so sure.
Yeah, no, that's valid. I want to kind of punt the Aviendha part of this chapter until the end, when we can just kind of consider Rand and Aviendha all three chapters together. So my last real note on this chapter then is I want to make sure that we understand kind of the history and context of the sword that Rand gives Aviendha, and also I think it's really interesting that gift coming from her I think is very meaningful in a way that she doesn't fully understand, right? So one, this is King Laman's sword. Quick history lesson. King Laman was the king of Cairhien who cut down the tree and caused the Aiel War, and his death was what ended the Aiel War. So this was basically, presumably, kind of the prized treasure of the war. It is the kind of conquered king's, weapon, but it is a weapon that Aiel are so strongly forbidden from holding that it turns out not even their blacksmiths are willing to hold a sword for long enough to remove gemstones from it. And then the fact that it is power forged, I think, is really interesting because Rand's previous sword that he got from his father was power forged. They're not supposed to be able to be destroyed, but his uniquely was in the side of one of the Forsaken. So this being kind of the replacement for the sword his father gave him is really fascinating, coming from a representative of the culture that in one way is very much replacing his father in terms of what he thinks of as his family and his past. I'm curious what you thought of that gift and Rand's reaction to it, because it's really kind of historically and world building weighty in addition to the relationship that it's kind of augmenting.
Let the record show in a way I can't prove that I actually had all that knowledge in my head. I almost interrupted as you started to say, let me do it. But I think I was pretty close. I had most of those. I thought, there's a clear message here, which is that Rand does not value the history, but he values the object, right? I was thinking my good Indiana Jones, it belongs in a museum, right? This is a piece of world history, and yet he's like, I'll just break this because I don't want this part of it. So I liked the heron mark showing up again, and I thought the idea of a power-forged sword, and I know this reference is backwards, calm down, nerds, but it felt to me like the way the Valyrian steel and the dragon glass started to feel in Game of Thrones, which is that they hung out for a long time. You got a lot of references in the first 4 books, and then you found out this is the weapon that will kill the White Walkers, and it became hugely important. I'm not even sure the books got to that yet, or if that's just a show revelation. Speaking of blurred lines, so that to me feels like these power forged blades are going to play a bigger role than they could. Now, to the second piece, the piece I would say I didn't have from your description is this kind of cool idea that you said of his heritage was lost with the other blade, and now he's found his other heritage. And I think you're right that is kind of replacing his father, but it is then a representation of his mother, right? Like, meaning his actual mother, not the father that raised him, but his biological mother. And so that's really curious. I think whenever there's a blade and a hilt and you snap off the hilt, the question becomes, what do you replace it with? And so it seems to me that this object could very easily become a symbol of him uniting these two worlds, right? If this blade so much represents the king, he could put an Aiel hilt on it. And I also, just to complete another Indiana Jones reference, it should not be encrusted in jewels. It should be the cup of a carpenter. It should be something plain and something humble. That's more Rand's style. So I kind of expect him to get like a simple wooden handle on it, and then we'll have the fancy blade in a not so fancy hilt, and that's Rand.
I like that a lot. I just want to note, if we're thinking about this in the way that we did Valyrian Steel, at this point, I think we only for sure know about 3 power-forged weapons, although we know that there are others around, mostly with warders probably. But we know that Lan's sword is power-forged. We learn in this chapter that Matt's spear that he got from the Aelfin is power-forged, and now Rand has the power-forged sword that he just received from Aviendha.
But those don't have the heron mark. The heron mark is independent of the power forge, right? They don't necessarily go together.
So we actually learn in this chapter that most of the power-forged swords from the Age of Legends have the heron mark, and the modern heron mark is in imitation of that from the power-forged swords that have been carried over. But it's worth noting that Matt's spear, while it is created in the same way, does not have the heron mark. Instead, it has, I think, 2 ravens and maybe something else on it.
So the heron mark is like when you're watching Antiques Roadshow and the guy flips over the urn and he looks and says, okay, this mark is there. Or he says this is a forgery of a classic mark. If this were the real thing, it would be worth $1,000, but instead you'll be lucky to get a nickel for this. So
that is absolutely
sometimes
correct.
It's ravens.
I just need to point out that all of that is accurate. And the other day I saw a image from Antiques Roadshow where someone was selling Pokemon cards, and I can't watch Antiques Roadshow anymore. That devastated my soul. I don't have anything else to say about the gift of a blade. Any last thoughts here before we dive into the next chapter?
No, I'm all for moving on without talking about flowers at a wedding, because we're stereotypical dudes tonight. So, chapter 22, Birdcalls by Night.
Matt is getting a massage from Melindra. This is more dude conversation. Melindra notes that both that he is very muscular and that he is quite short. Matt at first seems to take offense at this, but she reassures him it's exactly what he is looking for. Matt then starts thinking about the other lives when he was tall, and he asked Lan about some of the things that he remembered, and he basically confirmed all of the things that he knew, but also confirmed that all of his memories seemed to be from slightly before the Trolloc Wars to shortly after Arthur Hawkwing, putting that range at about 2,500 to 800 years ago. He thinks about Melindra and how he doesn't want to settle down, at least not anytime soon, and Melindra says he is made for greatness and asks why he hides in Rand's shadow. She says he should earn his own scars rather than earning them in Rand's defense, and he asks to know if she knows anything about the Daughter of the Nine Moons, which she reassures him she does not, apparently not for the first time. Suddenly, Matt hears a number of bird calls from the two rivers and realizes this is a sign of an attack. He grabs his medallion, thinking that there might be Black Aja, and then he comes outside where he battles a number of Trollocs as well as Dark Friends who are making their allegiance to Samael known, and then Matt battles a Merge Rail using the attack so hard they can't defend strategy strategy, eventually successfully. He kills the Murdrail and then realizes how futile the attack was, as there were not nearly enough people to ever get to Rand, and Melindra asks then what he said in the Old Tongue, and he translates it as "Glory to the Red Eagle," one of the battle cries of Manetheren. She seems pleased at his ability in battle, and he seems confused by the hopeless assault. We then switch into Rand's point of view, who wakes to the same bird call and steps out of his tent to observe what he thinks is a pointless battle. He kills a Dragcar that has stepped up behind Aviendha, and then in her nakedness, she pulls a blanket to cover herself and throws fire in his direction. He immediately is very upset at her until he turns around and sees a Dragcar behind him. She dismisses all of his apologies, calling him a fool, and then runs into the tent. The Wise Ones and Egwene then arrive. Egwene seems furious that the word "she" always trips me up when there's 8 women in a scene. Egwene shows up and accuses him of being a jerk to Aviendha, and says that he clearly upset her, as he has done many times before. And then the Wise Ones basically have a brief conversation about the pregnant couple in the background, about which newlywed was checked in on first. Then Moraine arrives, causing Rand to wonder why she was later than the rest, and I wonder that too. Moraine then asserts, in response to that question, that this night proves that he doesn't need her anymore, and then she also says the plan was too simple, and the Forsaken are never simple, so Rand should not assume it was just a wasted attack. We then note that Adeline of the Maidens offers Rand her spears for leaving him to join in the battle, as do many of the other Maidens of the Spear. He sends them back to guard duty without acknowledging any of their concerns. At this point, he sees Asmodean, who apologizes for not helping in the battle, but apparently Rand would have destroyed him if he channeled, and Asmodean knew that. Rand then thinks the attack sounds like Samael from the past, and he references one of Lews Therin's memories, which surprises Asmodean because it gives away information that he didn't know. At this point, they begin discussing several things, and then Rand returns to his tent, and when he does, the maidens wish to speak with him, but he tells them it is forgotten, and they can go to the Wise Ones if they have any more concerns, and then he falls asleep, once again dreaming of Aviendha attacking him. So we've got a second straight I Yield chapter. You didn't like it last time. Did fighting make it better? Massages?
Yeah. I mean, well, more the fighting. Now you made me almost agree to being a creep. The fighting worked well for me, and I think, what is most intriguing here is, of course, there's a Phantom Menace, right? In that we have this very obviously silly attack that was doomed to fail. And so this question of what forces are actually at work here is enough to really get me hooked in. And that's the part of this I responded to. I would say that, plus I really love the way Matt was presented as essentially remembering things from his other identity and having no clue, and it's just really clever. Like you in your summary, you referenced those moments where he's like, I've always been considered very tall, what are you talking about? And he just can't align with the fact that was a different self within that. So, and last thing I'll say is maybe this should have been really obvious to me before, but it is interesting to me that Matt is clearly becoming an ancient Manetheren at the moment the eagle banner is flying again, and that there is this way in which he could very naturally go link up with Perrin and feel very much at home. But it doesn't feel like it's going to be that simple, really, because they're centuries apart. So it is just curious. I don't know that I'd made that explicit connection before.
Yeah, and this actually helps us resolve, or at least start to resolve, one of the concerns we had in Prophecy at the end of the last book, is we had a couple of prophecies relating Matt to the Red Eagle of Manetheren, and we were very confused by that, because all signs kind of pointed to that being Perrin's plotline. So this at least is kind of our first tie. Some of his past lives apparently have that tie to the Red Eagle of Manetheren. The other note that I had just kind of broadly about this chapter is I thought it did a really good job of highlighting what Robert Jordan does so well in terms of his first-person perspective. Because in this chapter, we have Matt, who is thinking deeply about all of the things he's not doing, but is acting purely on instinct. And I think you get the real feel for that when he's thinking deeply about his past lives and then just switches to pure action narration in the second half of his set of the chapter. And that's very much contrasted against Rand, who is clearly thinking very deeply about everything that's going on, but we are not getting a lot of his internal thoughts, right? Most of what we get in this chapter is his thoughts on Aviendha and Moraine, and then when he's talking to Asmodean about Samael, he just says it sounds like Samael, but we don't get any of that kind of interiority. What does he remember and what causes him to think that? And I found that kind of contrast between the really open Matt and the really kind of closed off Rand to be kind of really helpful for understanding where those two characters are at. I'm curious whether you noticed that kind of perspective difference or what you thought about kind of how different the two halves of this chapter felt, even though they kind of described very similar events.
I can't pretend I made that observation, but I like that observation a lot, and it makes me really think about Rand studied prophecy off screen, right, or off the page, and I believe it was between books 3 and 4, or maybe it was 4 and 5. We just come to understand that he did a bunch of studying and has started to look at himself through those prophecies, and I think that also feels like it was closed off to us, right? That it happened off screen, and he's not often thinking out loud about how he does. That Samael moment could be him remembering what Samael is like, or it could be him understanding a prophecy potentially, right? Like, oh, this is how a Forsaken would be that way. Whereas we get Matt, on the other hand, who basically seems obsessed with figuring out who his bride is going to be. And he can't do it. He can't. And, you know, it is this funny thing. There was just a movie like this. I'm not going to remember what movie it was, where the character knew they were going to die. And so they kept, what was that movie? I don't know. So the character kept, like, they knew they would die on this certain beach, so they just were always fine doing the most dangerous things because they weren't on the beach. And then they got to the beach and they're like, all right, this is it. And so we're there. It's going to bug me what movie that was. I watched too many movies. So I think that is... to me, is kind of what Matt's doing. He's like, oh, well, I can have my fling and have my massages because this isn't my bride, right? Like, I'm still wild and fancy free, though he's still driven to kind of figure it out and see that coming. So he's asking about it. But to your original point that I've muttered my way through, it's like if Rand is that concerned, he hides it from us. But Matt, there's no interiority. It's just all out there.
The version of what you're describing that's kind of speaking to me at the moment is from the movie Big Fish, the Tim Burton movie.
Oh, yes.
Where the character knows how they die, and so it, kind of shapes how they're thinking about it. What I find is so funny about Matt is that he is so obsessed with not finding his wife that I think he kind of loses some of the fun that he would otherwise have from not having a wife. And the fact that he is unaware of that is, I think, just what is so fun about Matt as a character. The only other note I kind of had in the first half of this chapter was just we get a lot more kind of clear detail about what Matt is experiencing in terms of, like, the dates and how many people he feels like he remembers the lives of. And even, as you mentioned, the kind of off-screenness, the fact that he apparently checked with Lan to confirm that these were real memories and not figments of his imagination, I found his kind of puzzling that out to just be a fun thing to read about in the first section of the chapter. Did that or any of the other kind of moments with Rand kind of, or not Rand, with Matt kind of stand out as especially fun or interesting for you?
Yeah, I think that moment, and I particularly was having fun with him saying he had narrowed it down to a time period, right? That to me was the most fun detail, where he's like, oh, I don't have any dates from before this or after. I believe it's after the return of Arthur Hawking, right? Yeah. Like that. So, from my perspective, it was like, okay, so those are, he was born then, and then he was killed at that moment, right? And then we kind of get that narrowed down sense of it. But, like, it is very fun to have us get those clues with Matt, and Matt just can't, like, figure out why at all. It doesn't cross his mind.
Yeah, there is nothing more fun to me than having a character who has all of the pieces of the puzzle and just doesn't care to put them together, and so you get to kind of try to do it without their help. And that's what Matt is always good for. On the other hand, you know what Rand is always good for? Awkward nude scenes for some reason. know that this is, I think we can officially call this Rand and Aviendha thing a budding romance. I don't think we need to like pretend we're not seeing the signs at this point. But man, does Robert Jordan need to learn ways to have his characters fall in love other than just randomly being naked in the same room.
I mean, it has. I know the reference is backwards, but it makes me think about the early seasons of Game of Thrones where everybody made fun of the fact that this show did what was deemed sexposition, where, oh, we have a bunch of boring information to give you, so we'll just have a sex scene going on in the background. There's the Community joke again. But then it really, like, it just seems silly at this point, and I can't possibly imagine the television show going for this, right? Like they've had a few adult-ish moments, but they're not trying to be Game of Thrones, and I think because it's so unnecessary, they would get raked over the coals if they suddenly just had a character be naked for no reason half the time. But and we've seen across this book, like all the different women going into their dream world and happening to choose revealing clothes, like. They'll get their chance if they want to be Game of Thrones.
Oh, man, do they have all of the chances in the world. We're maybe like 4 or 5 weeks away from the most egregious example of it in the series. Get ready for that. I have kind of 3 notes on particular moments that I thought were interesting. The first for me is when Moraine arrives late. Because where in the world was Moraine? What was she doing? What was she dealing with? I think, given the previous chapter, maybe my best guess is something along the lines of she had to make sure the Terangrial were okay, or that wasn't the focus of the attack. But I don't know. This is the most nervous I've been about Moraine and her kind of willingness to side with Rand in a long time when she shows up later than everyone else and doesn't have a good reason.
I'm going to let you finish, but I'm also going to stop dividing my attention by scrolling through the movies I watched this year on Letterboxd. It was Bad Boys 4. One of the characters has a near-death experience and knows he won't. It's Martin Lawrence. It's only one of the two. It's Martin Lawrence.
So long to guess that, and I never would have gotten there.
And I was scrolling, and I just got away, and I'm like, I can't find it. And I was like, wait, I think it was Oh, my God, it was Bad Boys 4. So to answer your real question, I actually was surprised to hear that. I didn't clock that moment when you listed it in your summary. I was like, oh, good to know. Again, I think of, I've compared Moraine to Dumbledore and to Gandalf. Like there's a section of Harry Potter 6 where Gandalf really knows he's not long for this world and just lets he takes care of all his work and does his scheming. That becomes the climax of that book / movie. And I feel like that's just very much what Moraine is doing. So even though there's a good reason not to trust her here, there's bad guys about, she's there. I would guess, my heart still says she used the cover of this attack to do something that was necessary and had to be done, but Rand couldn't know about. So I still trust her.
Totally. The next 2 things that I have, I just want to lay them out there and let you talk about them. One, because it's speculation, and that's a thing I can't do. And the other, because I think we get more of it in the next chapter, but I need to highlight it here, right? So first, I think the moment with Asmodean questioning whether or not this was Samael, and Moraine saying the Forsaken are never simple, we shouldn't assume that this is as easy as it looks, that makes me ask the question, was this actually Samael? I'm going to let you deal with that however you would like to. I certainly can't answer that question. The other kind of piece here that I would love to hear your thoughts on in addition to this is Adolin and the maidens running off. We get a lot more about that in the next chapter, I think, but their kind of willingness to run away and participate in what feels like the simple battle, I think kind of complicates otherwise what else is going on here. Either of those things, what are your thoughts?
I read that moment with Moraine and Asmodean, I actually read that in the context of the Phantom Menace, as when Qui-Gon says to Padme, he says, like, the Queen trusts me, you should too, because he knows that she's secretly the Queen. I thought it was Moraine hinting that she understands who Asmodean really is, and that was her read on it. So that was how I interpreted that specific moment. Yeah. I felt more likely this attack is meant to just keep them off balance. The raptors in Jurassic Park keep testing the defenses. How many random movies can I reference? Nothing's going to beat Bad Boys 4. But, they keep testing the defenses, and they are trying to understand how strong are these wards, how strong is Rand, how strong is his protection. I agree that I don't think they thought this would work, but I think it was a little more straightforward than has been implied here, which is just, let's just keep on the pressure so that they're always a little off balance. I don't really have any deep thoughts on the other question you asked, mainly because I didn't really remember that it happened.
Valid.
Yeah.
Cool.
So maybe go into the next chapter and explain that to me. As you discussed, chapter 23, the fifth I give you.
Egwene watches the Aiel cross through Jengai Pass, thinking of the disused road and how over the past few decades it has fallen apart. She observes the Aiel part for a trickle of water that she thinks isn't really a river, and then she wonders about all of the ter'angreal that have been stacked up and how they are going to make it through all of their travels. She wonders if she could impose on Moraine for a favor of asking the Wise Ones to do more with her or to train more, or whether or not that could potentially get rid of what she thinks of as their newfound equality between her and Moraine. Egwene then notes that a number of the maidens, including Adolin, seem to have changed their clothing. They are now dressing more like traditional women rather than maidens. They are doing chores, and they are carrying around dolls. When she asks about this, she is simply told that this is a reminder to them that they are no longer children. They come across another village with more bodies hung up by Couladin, and the Aiel seem appalled by the amount of damage that's been done, despite the fact that they seem to accept the fact that there's nothing wrong with attacking, merely the killing that was done. Moraine advises Rand on the leaders of the area, and she even notes that if Couladin hadn't been more violent, this might have been someone who would have been willing to go over to his side rather than being killed. Rand is then debating with the chiefs and trying to discuss what their plan is moving forward, and he tells them that they may take the fifth, but they may not take food, and he says that there will be severe punishment for anyone taking more than the fifth or taking food without paying. The chiefs call this dark news because they think they rely on taking the fifth in order to survive, but Rand basically tells them to get in line and there is no option other than following his orders. Egwene, we switch into, or Egwene then worries about how demanding Rand has gotten, and she comments to Aviendha, who seems kind of disgusted at how much he is kind of taking charge, and at this point, Aviendha also notes that she is disgusted that Rand is carrying a sword, and she thinks that is at least part of the reason that the chiefs are resisting him so much. Egwene says that Aviendha isn't actually upset about the sword, but Aviendha refuses to let Rand apologize for yelling at her, and at this point, Aviendha asks Egwene to talk to the Wise Ones on her behalf to be let free from her duty of teaching Rand. Unfortunately for her, Cerelia, one of the Wise Ones, overhears her say this, and shuts that idea down very quickly. Cerelia then asks if the gems from the sword were an interest gift from Rand, and when Aviendha reveals that they were not, Cerelia seems to accept the fact that she is not interested in Rand, is disappointed in this, but then begins to try to set Aviendha up with another man. Cerelia asks if Rand will actually hang a clan chief as he has threatened, and Egwene thinks about this for some time, but then admits that he might. At this point, Aviendha, we learn, does not like the man that Cerelia was going to set her up with, but she agreed simply to keep Cerelia out of her personal life. Egwene then says that she will speak with the Wise Ones to get Aviendha out of her service, but Aviendha has apparently changed her mind about this and simply cannot explain why. Boy, is that a short summary, which I guess is nice, but I don't know what we pull out of this chapter. What did you think about this one?
This would be my least favorite of the three, but it is, I do think it's momentous that we returned over the pass, right? The fact that we are now fully in Cairhien, and I thought the entire point of the chapter was to establish Rand is trying to bring these two civilizations together, right? In the kind of very classical compromise sense that we will respect this part of your culture, but in order to do so, we will respect their right to have food. So, the idea that they still can claim a fifth as a conquering people, but they can't take more than that, and they have to leave all food, shows that Rand is interested and sees the political power, and I guess it's Moraine who reminds us of that, the political power of actually just accumulating allies instead of stomping over them. And that is compelling and just seems like, okay, now let's spend 10 books doing that, and then we'll have a giant army ready to fight whatever's left at the other side.
Yeah, and I really liked the contrast that early in the chapter, Rand thinks Couladin is kind of trying to do the same thing he is, right? He's trying to come across and take advantage of all of the resources in the West, but Moraine suggests that Couladin is doing a horrible job of it, right? The advice that she gives Rand is actually if Couladin had just taken his time, he could have had an ally here instead of an enemy. And the fact that that seems to be the lesson that Moraine is hitting over and over again, how Rand needs to be building bridges instead of destroying them, I thought that was kind of interesting. We've gotten a lot of Rand thinking about the fact that Moraine is advising him, but this is one of the few examples we've gotten of what actual advice she's giving, and I think it kind of tells us what she's worried about with Rand, and it's the fact that he could fracture what otherwise would be a united kind of force.
Yeah, and I guess as I'm mapping out the way forward, I have trouble seeing Couladin as a big threat. There are just too many real threats. He seems like a nuisance, right? He's the fly kind of buzzing around. The hero's actually doing stuff. And so as you just described, maybe this chapter made me think a little bit more like, well, he could really do enough damage that it delays the start of what could be the gathering of forces and allies. So that is helpful. And then to put it, understanding these are all problematic stereotypes, the way in which the Aiel kind of maps so nicely onto how Native Americans are portrayed in Westerns, again, problematically, it does feel very familiar to have kind of the tribes trying to be peaceful and do something different, and the tribe that chooses violence and savagery spoiling the chances, right? In classic fashion, that means that tribe will survive and this tribe will be injured by those actions, right? That's how a Western would be constructed. Again, recognizing that Westerns are poor representations of actual history.
Yeah, and I think that what Robert Jordan does really smartly in this chapter is in order to avoid that kind of historical analog, direct kind of allegory that, as you say, gets problematic very quickly, what he does instead is he gives us a variety of examples of the Aiel being faced with differences in culture, and in each case we get kind of a different reaction from that, and that reads kind of true to me. So I want to kind of just run through like 3 or 4 examples I saw of Aiel being kind of faced with one culture as well as their own, and how do they merge. The first of these is something that it seems like you either missed or didn't get the full details of in the previous chapter, the Wise Ones, most notably Adolin. So in the previous chapter, when the when the Trollocs and the Murdrail attack, it seems that the Wise Ones who were guarding Rand's tent ran off from guarding him towards the front line so they could participate in the battle. Once the Dragcar attack Rand, they are seemingly They seem to kind of feel they have given up some of their honor by doing so, by leaving him and not protecting him from the Dragcar. And so they offer Rand in the previous chapter their spears and ask him to adjudicate what is to be done, right? How can they make up for the dishonor they have put upon themselves? Rand's response is, there is no dishonor, but if you are worried about it, go see the Wise Ones. In this chapter, we see what appears to be what the Wise Ones have prescribed for them. Adolin and the other Wise Ones who were his guards now are doing chores. They are now dressing in skirts as opposed to purely in Maidens of the Spear clothing, and they are carrying around dolls. Now, it's worth noting earlier in, I think, the previous book, when Egwene had been misbehaving, the wise ones told her to wear her hair in pigtails like Aiel girls do, so we can assume that something similar is likely happening here. These these Maidens of the Spear feel as if they have kind of betrayed Rand in some way, they've let down their honor, and so they are making up for that by, as Adolin puts it, reminding themselves they are no longer children by basically kind of prostrating themselves in this kind of embarrassment. So I'm curious what you think about this reaction, right? The Aiel have this code of honor. Rand is not reacting to it the way they expect, and so they're kind of making up their own way through what do you do when you dishonor someone who doesn't follow Giotto.
Sounds like a broken society. I mean, it's like I don't have a lot to say about that. It's all kind of weird, right? In like the sense that it's maybe circulating in politics right now. Like that's weird. Yeah. I guess I can best interpret that through the most generous read I have of that is when the system is broken, people who have lived their life following the system just are lost and kind of stuck without any good substitution. So it feels like that's part of what Jordan is trying to demonstrate there. But yeah, I didn't clock much of that at all. And now, did I read this? I think I read this. Yeah, go ahead.
The second thing that I noted was Rand is almost, it seems like hesitant because he is worried that the Aiel will agree with what Couladin has done. And their reaction seems to be, we are not upset at all about the fact that Couladin invaded and attacked. We are only mad that he went too far. And as you were talking about compromises that the Aiel are actively making, that almost feels like a more passive compromise, right? It's our way of life is perfectly acceptable. We just need to make allowances for cultures that aren't prepared for these kind of attacks.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that sounds kind of like keep your house in order and not worry about the other side, right? Like, you know, our morality dictates that violent, but our morality does not care about invading these people who are oath breakers, right? It feels like they are responding to a more ancient calling than what Rand is demanding of them. And that, you know, that's kind of classic fantasy, right? I mean, that's essentially conservative versus progressive, not mapping that on another political system, but just the basic level of do we protect traditions or do we move forward to new traditions?
No, totally. The last moment, then, of this kind of contrast and compromise that you're describing is Rand and the Fifth, right? This idea that the Aiel are still entitled to spoils, but as you said, Rand wants to kind of take that concept and make it less harmful to the culture that is having their spoils taken, right? He wants them to be able to feed themselves, even if they might not have as much money as they did before. So the question for me, then, is the Aiel seem hesitant about that potential compromise, right? The wise ones agree to spread the word, but they call it dark news that will not be taken well. Are you seeing that as more symptoms of a broken culture? Are you seeing that as like a future worry for Rand? Do you see the splintering? This feels like the tensest of the compromises. What's your take on this one?
Yeah, I definitely think that is a portent for trouble ahead. And I'm not going to think of a good comparison at the moment, but usually in a story kind of like this, there's that one thing that really bothers them, and they will lash out about something else, but it will have started here. They're going to be so annoyed and frustrated that they're not getting their full rights that it's that kind of buzz of a common displeasure, and then there will be a flare-up where maybe Rand will kill an Aiel, and suddenly they will splinter off and go join Couladin because it fits there. You know, that feels like that can only increase as we go further into the continent, that as he continues to balance them, they will feel less and less called to follow him because they think they're getting a worse and worse deal, even if our perspective is more that it's balanced and fair.
And That I think is exactly the right place to be thinking about this. Is kind of where does this go? Because it feels fine now, but you can see all the kind of fine cracks that are forming that I think you're right to say long term is when it feels like this all potentially blows up. The woman who seems to have a plan and a solution for this is a new wise one for us, Cerilia. And Cerilia, she thinks that the solution is to get Rand and Aiel wife, and she seems very upset that it's not Aviendha. I don't have a ton of detail here, but this is a new character who seems more proactive than most of the other wise ones we have encountered so far. And I thought that was notable, particularly for Egwene, who I think the lesson she's been learning is kind of sit back, and so seeing a different form of wise one leadership might be really interesting for her going forward.
I mean, it makes me wonder about motivation, and also could we be seeing a Forsaken perhaps coming back as an Aiel or something like that, right? That there's, when you get a character that is that driven and that pushed, there should be an agenda there. And the simple answer that, like, create a political marriage seems a little too easy, right? Like that solution is there. So but at the same time, I mean, we heard a lot about Morghase's political marriages recently. This is a part of this world and a part of that. Yeah. So, I think I think I've already referenced my Grammy, who loved all my family members, but just assumed they were all miserable and hated themselves unless they were in a serious committed relationship, right? And so there's a little of that energy here where it's like, yeah, well, the only way to make him happy is to make sure he's got a good wife and a good partner. Never mind what he says he wants. I think, and I'll just use this to talk about all three chapters together, I do think this was, a budding romance type story, but I'm still having trouble seeing it as requited love. I was going to say seeing it not as unrequited love, but that just means anyway, don't need the double negative, that I don't see Rand. I see Rand around an attractive woman who is naked around him a lot. And why wouldn't that, be a distraction? And yet, like, I don't see him really feeling anything deep for her. I'm not sure where Rand's head is at in terms of his romance. I think he's left Egwene behind. He kind of made some promises to Elaine that they'd get back together at the end of summer. But I'm not sure he is really thinking about any of that. I think he's much more concerned with his destiny.
Yeah, I think the problem that you're identifying here is twofold, right? It's one, that the Rand we are getting right now is more interested in what is to come than what he is feeling at the moment. And so I think that is kind of limiting his ability to fully think through this relationship. And so I'm left unconvinced whether it is anything serious, or, as you're describing, it's just the naked lady who's always around, which when you're 18 is pretty much all it takes. The other kind of question that I kind of have for Rand then is how much of what Rand is doing is driven by hormones, I guess. I was looking for a better way to say that, but it seems like Cerilia is very convinced that Rand is someone who can be controlled by a pretty woman in his bedchamber. And I'm leaving these chapters, I think, agreeing with you that I'm not unconvinced by that argument, and I'm willing to embrace the double negative. Like, I think Rand maybe is as susceptible to this kind of manipulation as the wise ones think. And my question isn't, is Rand as into it as Robert Jordan wants us to believe? It's, why isn't Aviendha into it? Or is she lying to herself when she says she isn't?
I would say she's lying to herself a little bit, and she's got the convenient excuse of she made the promise to Elaine. And so that makes the lie to herself solid, right? It makes it steely, so that she's kind of covered for that. We were talking a lot earlier about the voice of Lews Therin in his head, and maybe it is just the voice of hormones in his head being that kind of libido motivating him more than that. I know we've gotten some hints that Lews Therin was together with Lanfear in at least some of the pasts, so it would suggest that he is a bit of a Lothario, and maybe that is part of what motivates him, but I don't know. For me, he feels much more celibate and maybe his body is just fighting that. It's also just a reminder, as you alluded to, just to make the obvious statement, he's just also young, right? He's just 18, and this is what happens. So
I need every longtime book reader to know that if I could whistle, I would have been whistling while Greg was talking about Lews Therin being a Lothario. That's a joke that you'll get in like 4 books, Greg. If you were really disappointed by these chapters and you thought, man, there's a lot of romance, I wish there was less romance, I'm so sorry for the name of the second of 3 chapters that we are reading next week. That's right, it's 3 chapters again. Chapter 24, A Message Sent. Chapter 25, Q. Greg's Groan, Dreams of Galad. And Chapter 26, Sally Dara. One of them is a girl's name, one of those includes a boy's name who you hate. What are you looking forward to next week, Greg?
Stop making Galad a thing. He's not a thing. No, I mean, I am very much feeling, I don't think it's just from your comments, I'm feeling like I need this book to get into overdrive, right? We got to put down the gas pedal, because we went from that, okay, he's clearing his throat moment, and we're in this limbo before it really feels like important major things are happening. So that's what I'm looking forward to. But I don't think it's coming next week. I'm assuming it'll be 2 weeks at least. Next time, or the time after, Through the Glass Columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, Amazon, or our wives. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, find us on Instagram or Threads by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being a part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe, leave us a review wherever you are listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time on Through the Glass Columns.